welcome the three of you, and thank you for taking time out in your busy schedules and coming in from Buffalo and elsewhere. Many of you probably know Freyda, who is Spira, who is an associate curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum, who specializes in Northern Renaissance and Baroque prints and drawings and illustrated books. All three. Her recent exhibitions include The Power of Prints, the legacy of William Ivins and Hyatt Mayer from 2016, which was on the centennial of the founding of the department. Really dug deep into your predecessors, the founder and his protege in the department. She also importantly curated 2016 Wordplay, Matthias Buchler's drawings from the collection of Ricky J, and I'm going to hear more about that project tonight. And Freyda, along with Nadine Winstein, who heads the department there, is working on a really fascinating exhibition called The Renaissance of Etching, and that will open in less than a year, in October of next year. So we look forward to that. David Wachtel at the end is an independent scholar who has over 25 years of experience as a researcher, librarian, cataloger, curator, teacher, consultant, appraiser in the field of Hebrew and Jewish-related rare books and manuscripts. He's formerly the research librarian for special collections at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He's curated numerous exhibitions, most notably Three Faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam at the New York Public Library, as well as at the Museum at Temple Emmanuel and the Jewish Theological Seminary. He's a senior consultant for Judaica. He was a senior consultant up until 2017, for many, many years at Sotheby's. And has participated in the sales and among other exciting events. So he's a
gun for hire.
Gun for hire. And Matthew Kenyon is a new media artist who lives and works in Buffalo, state where he teaches in the art department and is director of the graduate studies program at the University of Buffalo. He is a founder of SWAMP, which is short for the Studies of Work, Atmosphere, and Mass Production. It's a project that you've pursued for a while now, since 1999, that focuses on critical themes addressing the effects of global corporate operations, mass media and communications, military-industrial complexes, and general meditations on the liminal area between life and artificial life. And his work is installed on the floor. It's like a stack of notepads, just staples, but it's really anything but that. And so the simplicity of it really belies really important message. It's in the collection, an example or a few examples of the notepad in the collection is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. He's a TED Fellow and an Al Fellow. We're really, really honored that you're all here to share your knowledge with our group. And so we're going to run it like a bit of a conversation, undoubtedly with all sorts of tangents and interesting questions from the audience, I'm sure. And we're just looking forward to having some of these really unfathomable works contextualized historically, parsing them out. They just kind of defy notions of what art is and can be and how you create things on such a small scale. And so we'll learn about why these objects were made, where they were made, how they were circulated and function, and what they tell us about our world. So we'll go from the micro to the macro with issues of religion and war and memorialization. And so I thought we could just lead off that the earliest works in the show are the Püchlers, the two small works that are a pair that are on loan from the Met. And Freyda will speak about those, but I thought we could start by talking a little bit about, with David, the beginnings of microcalligraphy, which I have trouble spitting out, which goes back to the 9th century. And then, so perhaps you could give us the whys and hows it all started, the role that it played in Judaism. It's also played a role in Christianity and many other religions. So give us what you've got.
Do I need to?
If you can, it'll help with the recording.
Okay.
Oh. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. None of you have to change your phone plans.
I was talking to Freyda before, we said, how every article about micrography ever written starts with how this is a Jewish art form beginning in the late 9th, early 10th century. And the reason every article starts that way is because you want to start at the beginning, and that's essentially so. Micrography begins, the earliest dated piece that we have with evidence of micrography is in 895. It's the Cairo Codex. It's a codex of the Bible. And by micrography, I literally mean just very small writing. Within the text itself, there's only a few pages that show decorative writing formed out of letters. But as we progress through into the 10th century, almost here. In 10th century, 11th century, and with Bibles being produced even first of all in the Near East, and then later on in Northern Europe, in Spain, as well as in Northern Europe and Germanic-speaking lands, we begin to see more and more use of this very, very minute text. I'm sorry, I skipped a little bit. What is the subject of the minute text? The biblical text is written out in its normal size. And then, essentially, a scholarly apparatus called Masorah, which essentially indicates how many different times certain word phrases appear elsewhere in the Bible, where to find them, when a word is unique. Well, the hapax legomenon, that's not an Aramaic word, it's Greek or Latin? Probably Greek. But it means something that appears only once. All this kind of information, which now you can just do Control F on your computer and find out where another example of the same phrase is. This is it's a code built in the margins of the text. Most biblical codices, most Hebrew biblical codices, are arranged in three narrow columns to a page, so that there's plenty of marginal space in between the columns as well as on top and the bottom, and that text begins to be put there. It's been speculated that the reason that the text of the Bible, which had been transmitted without Masorah for many centuries, the reason that it begins to appear in writing is because of a schism that takes place in Judaism in the 9th and 10th century with Karaites and Rabbinites, so different sects of Jews, all about the proper transmission of the Bible and adherence to the text. As the Karaites dwindle in historical numbers and importance towards the development of Judaism, the reason to insert this text, which had an informational content but also polemical subtext, became less. And scribes writing in this very, very, very tiny script decided that what they could do to jazz up the page, and that's an anachronistic term, but I mean they really are trying to make something more interesting, and they begin to make geometric figures, eventually animals, peoples, out of the words of the text using very, very small letters. Now these appear in two different forms. One are calligrams, that is to say, lines of parallel text bordered, and whose border then makes a shape. And then there is true micrography, which is the using of the letters of the words to form shapes. I would say that it's not my piece, but I mean these are micrographic in that the shapes of the heads are formed by the letters. This is the Van Gelder piece that I'm going to talk about in a moment is microcalligraphy. There are essentially in this whole piece there's there's one instance of using the text as an artistic element. That being said, the use of micrography to decorate Hebrew Bibles became more and more pronounced. After the 15th century, with the dwindling of manuscript production in the face of print, micrography continued in different forms, not so much in Bibles, but in marriage documents, in wall hangings. I mean, we see it developing, and just about the beginning of the 19th century, when lithography becomes a viable production method, we see an explosion of different popular micrographic works, such as the Van Gelder. I think does that work for an introduction?
Yeah, I think so. Can you tell us how they, under what conditions, was there magnification? How, sort of process oriented as a print person, but maybe, well, you'll elaborate, maybe both of you can elaborate on the how.
I don't know. They haven't, no one's left us any notes. We know, I think we have evidence of people using spectacles as early as the 12th century, but I would think that it would amaze me to think that that they didn't have some form of magnification, either filling a jar of water and holding it in an appropriate. I don't know what the method was. It's mind-boggling, and I can't see this far, but there's the short answer is I don't know. I've heard tales of very fine writing implements using ink that is sufficiently viscous to be painted by something the width of the hair. That's for the people who write the Lord's Prayer on the head of on a piece of rice, which is not what this is about. But I think more work needs to be done on that. I just don't know. Maybe,
yeah, I think as you pointed out, micrography is about ingenuity and artistic expression, and I think there is evidence. There has been, talk and evidence of people using straight edges and magnification and certain kinds of tools to create the micrographic text. So I don't think there's definitive proof, but there is definitely the idea that something had to be used exactly to create it, because some of them are so small and written in such an abstract way that they'd have to be marked out with graphite before they are then translated into a different medium.
So tell us, maybe we can start with Püchler, historically, late 1600s, 17th century. Tell us about him and his contemporaries.
So I think I'll just start by saying how I got to be the world specialist of Püchler. I was approached to work on an exhibition with the sleight of hand artist Ricky J, who collects Matthäus Buchinger, and I can show you a work by Buchinger that was in the exhibition that I curated in 2016. Maybe take those another and Matthäus Buchinger was an 18th century, mid-18th century artist and performer. He was from Nuremberg. And he became, I don't want to say a circus act, but he became sort of a performer and sort of a very remarkable person who traveled throughout Europe to the different courts and cities to perform and show off his skills. He was born as a dwarf without hands and feet, and he used his appendages to create works of art. This is a portrait of him. It's believed to be after a self-portrait that he drew of himself. And Ricky J spent his collecting life in search of the original drawing, which he believed he found, but he did not. But you can see the hair, his wig, is made up of minute lines of text. And that became his signature style. So as I worked on Buchinger, I started to search our collection for related works that could make sense in the context of Buchinger, who's working in the mid-18th century. And I came upon a friendship album which we bought in 2007, which contained a work by Buchinger, actually a perpetual calendar. And in that album was a work by Püchler, the portrait of Martin Luther. And it just struck me as the great affinity of styles. Püchler was working in the period just before Buchinger. They overlapped while they were living in Nuremberg, and it seemed to me as an art historian that there was no way that Buchinger could have taught himself the art of micrography. And so I started digging more into the output of both of these artists and found that Buchinger, who sort of became a micrographer very late in his life, he was sequestered in his home by his parents because they wanted to shelter him from being a spectacle because he was very different. And so it wasn't until his parents passed away that he was able to go out and perform and make money. So he came onto the scene very late in his life, and he just became a sensation because he could create these incredible works without hands. But when I look back at the output of both of the artists, there were many instances in which Buchinger was directly copying Püchler. And I thought, this has never been looked at before, and so I started investigating Püchler, thinking about how he was the first artist in the early 18th century to transfer the technique of micrography, which was a courtly pursuit. It's a very painstaking activity, and it was done mostly in the courts of Europe. And his father and his brothers were also micrographers. And he takes their technique, which they did as drawings, and he transformed it into a technique of reproduction, a printed technique. And so he really changes the way micrography is just distributed and how people understand it in the 18th century.
And what was that reproduction technique?
Engraving?
Engraving, so they were drawn directly on plates.
They were drawn directly on plates, right?
Okay.
And so there are no known drawings of the subjects that we have here by Püchler, but he made drawings. So he was still taking part in his family's business, and he's worked for the courts, for the Habsburg courts as well, just as his father did. But he was creating prints so that he could, I guess, transmit the idea of micrography and the image of the emperor. And he also creates a lot of portraits of not only the Lutheran or the Protestant leaders, Luther and Calvin, but he does successive portraits of all the Habsburg rulers.
And what's the edition size? How many of each were produced? Do you have any guess?
I don't. I mean, it seems that he created versions of different compositions. So there are about 6 different versions of the Luther portrait. Many of them are only known in a few impressions, which leads me to believe that they were, used up, actually used as things. A lot of them contain biblical and liturgical texts, and so if you have a portrait of Luther and one of the inscriptions says, the word of God is eternal, and within it are biblical and liturgical texts, almost like the order of the Mass. They could have been used as tools for prayer and contemplation.
And is this generally the scale? There's such a difference in scale. So you can talk about that, but generally, is that typical of the scale of the micrography?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would have taken a lot longer to make anything bigger. But yeah, that's generally the scale. And the portrait of Leopold and his sons is on a much larger scale than most of his other works. Most of them are pretty small. And Buchinger as well made very small, small kind of souvenir-like objects where he could create an image and then personalize it on the spot for someone. He would then use micrography in front of a crowd to show off what he could do.
And a little bit of a tangent, but because the obituary was just in the New York Times, Ricky J, maybe you can say a couple of words about his collecting versus his other profession, and how
So,
that came about.
yeah, so Ricky Jay was sort of the greatest sleight of hand artist alive in the later part of the 20th century. And he was kind of a LA personality. He not only was a magician, but he also was an actor and worked with David Mamet and was very involved in collecting and also in writing the history of the weird and the unusual. And Buchinger became an obsession of his because his mentor had a collection as well, and when he was young and working with his mentor, he was going through his collection and he saw a work by Buchinger and became instantly fascinated by it. Because Buchinger was not only an artist and performer, he originated some of the sleight of hand tricks that Ricky Jay still performed. And so he did all of these, I'm going to butcher them, but sort of all of these ball and cup tricks, and he was a sleight of hand artist, even though he had no hands. I don't know, he just, he had appendages and he was very charming. He married 4 times and had 14 children, and so I think he just knew how to delight people, and Ricky was sort of a student of history, and so he used these very early 18th century tricks and he adapted them and brought them up to date. So he became obsessed with him as a sleight of hand artist and also as an artist. And he started amassing a huge collection of Buchinger. I mean, a huge collection, I should say, is about 50 things. There are other collections of Buchinger. He traveled throughout continental Europe and then spent sort of the last part of his life in the British Isles and settled in Ireland. So actually the British Museum, the British Library, they have collections of his work and actually collections of sort of letters and correspondence. He was also the subject of many sort of articles and advertisements in newspapers, and a lot of that is in English and in British collections. So if you want to study more about Buchinger, England is probably the best place to go because his origins were very, I guess, shadowed in mystery. So Ricky collected not only drawings by Buchinger, because he was a draftsman, but prints of him, like the portrait that I showed you. And he sort of had the greatest collection of ephemera related to magic, and still does. So it would be really wonderful. There are books and posters and broadsheets and prints, and it's really a spectacular collection. And we'll be getting at the Med 2 works by Buchinger from his collection.
I just want to say that, those of us, that means me, who study Van Gelder, are jealous. Because there's really, Van Gelder is I guess the opposite story. An artist only tangentially known in his life, with left very, very little record. And the study of his work is really only beginning because there's just so little known about it. You get the pieces that survive do act as a really powerful impetus to the people who are viewing them. The first tranche of pieces known that he did were all in Dutch and smaller, maybe a quarter, approximately the size of this piece. And then, by default, I've become the leading expert on Van Gelder only because I lost a bet to Sharon. I mean, we both had to catalog this piece in Sotheby's, and she said, "You do it." And I said, "No, you do it." And she said, "You do it." And she was more senior, at Sotheby's, so I lost. But as a result,
I did a better job. That was okay.
As a result, I mean, I'm really by training and by preference, I'm more interested in medieval manuscripts. Yet I've wandered into this 19th century foray only because I'm desperate to find something out. I can tell you the ages and birthdays of all 9 of his children. He had only 9, and he had all his limbs. But I can't tell you. The only thing is, there's very little I can tell you there are no contemporary records of it, certainly of his artwork. I mean, the little I have is from whatever genealogical sources. I will tell you one interesting thing, just take rest for a second. Last night in preparations, I was reviewing the material, the limited material that I have about the man Van Gelder. We haven't talked about his art yet. But I discovered that on three different ship's manifests that he was traveling. One a ship with 16 passengers, one a ship with 70 passengers, and one a ship with 380 passengers. Levi David van Gelder and his family are always the first people registered. Now, it takes a certain kind of personality. You probably know someone like that. Who say, well, 5 o'clock we get off the cruise ship? Okay, this wasn't a cruise ship, right? We'll be there at 3. All right? I don't know, I mean, again, it's totally speculative, but you can see that someone who can do this kind of work has to be really, I don't know if it's a technical, diagnosis of OCD, but I mean, it certainly seems that you have to be really obsessive, at least about what you're producing.
Can you dig in a little bit to the imagery? I mean, you've got reference to the Sabbath, to Jehovah, Old Testament. Tell us what we're looking at and the structure and where you can see text.
Van Gelder was born in 1815, and by the time he's 25, he's listed as a printer. But he produces this type of he produces over the next few years 5 different devotional plaques, and you can actually hit that as long as I get them back because my notes are on the back. The colors, by the way, have no resemblance to the real colors, just different times in the life of my printer.
Okay.
They look gray and white, they look like, oh, this is color, isn't it? It's hand colored afterwards.
Okay, and there's one more. And you can, so these are the first pieces. These are the first pieces he produces in the 1840s. All 4 of those are essentially what we would call devotional plaques. That is to say, there's something that can be hung on a wall, and in a space where prayer will take place. Some of them say Mizrach, which is east, and is a directional tablet to be put on the wall, so that to indicate in what direction one ought to direct their prayers. Usually, I mean, the tradition is to direct your prayers to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is always, at least typologically speaking, in the east. Although from Holland, we do a lot more south to the southeast. But the plaques have a Torah scroll, and then a couple of biblical vignettes, and many, many texts. The texts are drawn from essentially 2 places. One is from the Dutch translation of the Bible, and then there's also words of liturgical prayers, mostly for the high holidays, and especially for Yom Kippur. And these are produced, and there's, Sharon would know better than I, the numbers in which they survive. They're not great numbers, but there's I think one of those is an unicum, otherwise there are several copies of each, in various collections, museum or private collections. In 1853, Van Gelder moves to England, where he produces a piece this size but a manuscript. Sold last year at Sotheby's, now in a private American collection. But it was like his Dutch pieces, but everything had been natural and was now in English. Some of the scenes were the same, but it was it was along this line of complexity. That is, there's about 88 vignettes here. That piece had also in that general number, and the vignettes here, along this top register, The very most interesting thing here is that in the very center, there is an amalgamation of Masonic symbols. Van Gelder, even when he was in Holland, was a Freemason. It also turns out that he was a Kabbalist. He also sold real estate when he got to the United States. He was really a man that was imbued with spirituality, and his eulogies, the eulogies of him after his death, speak mostly about his Masonic work. So it's very clearly tied in. But even in that one rondel at the top, where there are the Masonic symbols, there's the anchor, the ladder, the compass, and so thank you. There's also a Hebrew quotation from the prophet, the Ethics of the Fathers, which literally says the day is long, the workers are lazy, and the pay is rotten, and the boss is pushing, meaning the boss, right? So that's, and it's interesting, that's the only place, that one rondel, which he has reused from other pieces in this 1865 printed version, or lithography, that's the one place where the text of the words, in this case the Hebrew words, are actually part of forming the picture. Elsewhere, I think due to the exigencies of lithography, all of the use of words as parts of the images of these various scenes, and there's creation scenes, then there's scenes from Genesis, then there's 3 registers of Egypt and slavery and Exodus, then there's a couple from King David, the life of King David and King Solomon, and interspersed around are other various books of the Bible. So it was long believed that this print and this lithograph and another version of it, very, very close but different version, a copy of which is at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, that these were produced here in America. And there's no way to know. We know that they're certainly registered with the Secretary of State of Illinois in 1865, according to an Act of Congress, because in some copies that's actually printed at the bottom. Although most times with the framed copies, it's impossible to see that. But the discovery now of 3 manuscripts of this size, 2 of which are dated and localized to England, one in Liverpool and one in London, and a third one which is not dated or localized, you have to remember that a lot of this work and the preparatory work for it was done in England, even though he ends up coming to America in 1864 after spending a decade in England, and here is where he produces these lithographs, at least the 2 different versions, and perhaps a third, and I will know better when I see it more closely. And they are circa 1864, 1865. Towards the end of his life, we don't know of him producing anything else, but we do know that he took it upon himself in the last year of his life in 1878 to write amulets to cure yellow fever with his Kabbalistic training. Wonderful articles, in the Chicago Tribune about it. He died a month later. I would love to say what he died of yellow fever. So you now know almost as much about Levi David van Gelder as I do, except the birthdays and stuff like that. But yeah, we can talk about that later.
I have a lot of questions. We couldn't resurrect Püchler or Van Gelder, but we have the artist and the work here. And it's the most innocuous, or so you think, thing. And when we opened the exhibition and people came in, they sort of couldn't understand why we had office supplies on the floor, and lots of questions. And we have the whole text, but people generally don't read anymore. So the staff and I are constantly coming out and asking questions. So this is a print, and it has micro, what do we micro printing, it's not engraving. And the text is actually, I'll just want to sort of prompt you, but have you speak about it. Maybe we can tear a couple of sheets out that we've been doing it, and you can pass them along with the loop. And so, Matthew, thank you for coming all the way from Buffalo today. Share with us an example of contemporary micro that also has macro ideas.
Thank you.
So thanks for being here.
Yeah, and thank you all for coming in today. So this project is called Notepad, and what looks like an everyday yellow legal tablet of paper actually contains thousands of Iraqi civilian names, individual details of Iraqi civilian deaths as a result of the US-led invasion of Iraq, the most recent one. And so what I did is I printed hundreds of pounds of this paper industrially, using, I had to collaborate with an industrial offset litho printer in Houston, Texas, of all places. And I do a couple of things with this paper. First, the first edition, I smuggled it into the stationery supply of the US government. So it went under the noses of people who were at the time authorizing the use of force in Iraq. So I continued to do that for several years. This project started in 2007. And then after a while, I was thinking, because the idea for this was to smuggle the civilian body count data into the permanent archives of our government, so that at some point, at some historical moment, this kind of like a Trojan horse, kind of memorializing this within the infrastructure of the government itself. Because if someone important writes on this paper, this is yellow legal paper, which is like our government is crawling with lawyers, and this is like the stationary of lawyers. If someone important writes on this, and at the end of the day, at the end of the administration, they take these pieces of paper, these are like the source tags of our history, and they get de-acidified and put into archives. And so that was the idea, was to put it under the noses of people in power in the US and the coalition government. So I've gone all over the world smuggling this stuff into different offices. And then I started a project maybe in 2010 where I would give it out freely in exhibitions like this one, and also people request it through my website, and so I send it all over the world, and I give it to people and encourage them to use it as stationery, kind of like this exercise we all did, maybe the civics exercise in grade school, where we write a really nice letter to a member of government, right? And like my teacher said, if you do a really good job, you'll get more than just like some shitty form letter back, right? And so that's what I've been doing is, and then as unfortunately, we haven't left, right? We're still have quite a military presence there. I've been printing multiple editions as more information about the civilian body count data comes to be known. So the original data set was a hodgepodge from the Lancet study on morbidity, mortality, and also some information pulled from the Iraq body count kind of NGO that was organizing this. And then later on, after WikiLeaks released the Iraq war logs, I incorporated that additional data into subsequent printings. And so then, so after distributing it, kind of like what would be like a crowdsourcing kind of campaign to get for people to write letters, and then to individual libraries and governmental offices, because they keep those letters, if for only for security reasons, but they maintain archives of letters that people send in. Then after the Bush administration ended, and a few years passed, I wondered, like, what maybe if any of the people who authorized use of force for the invasion, if maybe they had come to some new realizations about the war. And so then whenever I can, I meet with former members of the government and share the project with them in a very upfront way. And so that's how I ended up talking in a strange twist of fate, I ended up giving a talk at the same venue as Alberto Gonzalez, the torture memo author. And I shared the project with him before his men had been removed politely, I guess, yeah. So.
And are there others in government that are aware that these are now in the archives? I mean, it's really it's so many different things. Once it's an intervention, and so is it still underground, or I mean, certain people know, but do the folks in the archives know?
I don't know. I mean, I'm working on a project that would be like a freedom of information request for everything that's canary yellow in the U.S.
Need a lot of space.
Yeah. So, not sure. Yeah, I met with Morgan Slukanov, who is the Danish foreign minister leading up to the invasion. And he was a really solid guy. Spent over an hour with me talking about how the decision, from his perspective, how that decision was being made. And both he and his office staff were really interested in the project and collected talents as well. But our own government seems to still be sort of holding the line that this was a necessary thing.
And so tell us a little bit about the technological side of it. What programming, what software, how did it all come together in terms of creating the digital files and then locating the right printer out in Texas? And that's a pretty special printer that you used out there. How you convinced them to work on your project?
So I come from like a military family. Both my father and my stepfather served in the U.S. war in Vietnam. And so this project actually started with a project that was very different. It was called the IED, which my IED stood for improvised empathetic device instead of the improvised explosive devices, which were these bombs that often had like a modified cell phone or a pager as a kind of remote trigger for an explosive device, often like a kind of repurposed ordnance shell. And so what I did, this was at the height of the U.S. casualty service people deaths in Iraq. I built these black armbands that I would wear that would monitor the accumulation of U.S. service persons dying in Iraq. And each time the CENTCOM or Department of Defense released their personal data that they had died, each time that they would release this data, the armband would stab me in the arm with a needle once for each person who died, and then would also display the name, rank, cause of death, and hometown of the soldier. And so my purpose of that project was to kind of, the dead Kennedy, anybody remember the dead Kennedys, like Jello Biafra, like that's his quote, like, don't hate the media, be the media. And at the time I was hating on the media pretty heavy, and so this device was a way to sort of bypass the kind of media filter to create like a personal, visceral connection with the body count data that was, as you guys remember, coming in over the radio and television, and then we'd be kind of habituated to that knowledge coming in, and so this was a way of kind of trying to bypass that. I mean, it failed miserably, of course, because any amount of pain you could inflict on yourself would, pales in comparison to somebody who's lost someone in the war, right? But in doing that research, then I became like aware, as many of us, that for every one soldier that was dying overseas, there were maybe between 255 and 500 civilians dying. And so then I was thinking of ways to take this kind of subtext of the war and create a memorial for it. And often memorials are kind of really one-sided, like, Maya Lin's Vietnam memorial is really powerful, but we only build these sort of memorials for our own people, right? Except for Chris Burden has this amazing memorial for Vietnam. But anyway, so what I did is I came across this printing technique that is used for counterfeit protection for currency. So if you look at a dollar bill under magnifying lens, you can see that, like, the one on the $1 bill is made up of a lot of little words for one and this sort of thing. But often on your check, if you still use checks, paper checks, that signature line is a micro-printed name of the bank often. And so I thought this would be great, like that the blank tablet would be this kind of blank form that would be very innocuous and be a kind of perfect vehicle for smuggling something in. I wanted it to be something that lived in the world and people would participate with, both knowingly and unknowingly, and also something that might create like a genuine sense of paranoia of people who are in power, surrounded by these sort of yellow tablets that even if I couldn't get them everywhere, they are everywhere, and so there's something kind of transformative when art kind of appropriates like a familiar thing. But yeah, and so I met, I just did a bunch of research and talked to some printers that I know. This is a pretty conservative group of folks because of the business that they do, like for continuous legal documents, continuous forms and checks. They're not art printers. They're they have and so it was a challenge to get them to accept. And so they start out as digital files, drawn up in like an Illustrator, and they're printed on plastic sheets that are quite large, and then they're optically reduced down, and then they're assembled in a factory. So each tablet is about 10,000 names, but there may be duplicate sheets and things like that within each individual tablet, because sort of collating sheets of micro-printed text is a bit of a challenge at an industrial level. So it's a red and a blue.
It's the red and the blue, and then the binding, it's one-sided, so that is a clue. The paper is a lot nicer.
Yeah, it's
really beautiful.
Yeah. It had to be nicer paper because you can't print like a inkjet printing or any of this. The droplets are too big for this, so it has to be
a finer surface.
Yeah, it needs a finer surface.
And then, Matt, I want to ask you a question regarding, I don't know, but would it be safe to assume that technologically they could make it even smaller, but you want a size where it could be seen? I mean, if you, now that you know, if you look at it with the naked eye, you know something's going on there. And with simple magnification, you can make it out. I assume it couldn't be made smaller by design. That was the limit of the size you wanted it?
If you go much smaller, you lose kind of predictability. You end up getting incidentals that make it difficult to read.
Like the paper surface.
Yeah.
Paper surface is limited.
Yeah.
I mean, you have much smaller things in microchip production, which is effectively the same thing. It's photographic, minute production, but that is sort of like in a dust-free vacuum chamber.
But you also
They're not
want,
printing on paper.
the effect you want to create is the look that we all know from every yellow pad we've ever held, with these blue lines and these red lines. And if you made it, I mean, I think it's just the right size for what it's doing, because for all intents and purposes, it looks exactly like what you want it to.
Yeah.
So it looks like a ready-made.
Yeah.
So is there anywhere in any of the pads a note about the project and your name?
Yeah. And here we have the wall label, and then we also have some addresses and people, politicians that we could write to. But other than that, I mean, it really is.
And the taxonomy,
Interventions.
yeah, the taxonomy for the names, I just sort of went with the resource, the different data sets I was working with. Sometimes, they have the full name, but sometimes also it's referred to like the brother or the sister of so and so. So I just kept whatever kind of taxonomy or nomenclature that the different sources were using. So that's the only kind of inconsistent thing. And I should say, like, you're welcome to take a couple of sheets with you. Sometimes what I suggest folks to do is put a sheet of carbon paper in between, and you can keep.
Carbon?
Yeah.
That exists?
Yeah. Actually, I had a show at the Katzen Museum in DC, and I have this amazing collection of the carbons because we kept all the carbons from people writing. And I was just thinking of these, like thinking of the right. But yeah, so that way people can keep a copy of the letter that they write, and then I ask people to either send me photos of the carbons or send them to me as well. Kind of beautiful objects in themselves. But and then I gave a TED talk on this in 2015, I think it was, and then opened up the project to people all over the world. So you can go to my website, or you can email me and request sheets or tablets of this paper, and I mail it all over the world, and for people to have letter writing sort of interventions and things like that. And so I've had a lot of correspondence from veterans and refugees and folks from all over the world who've written on it. So.
When you write them back, you write on pen?
No, I don't. I can't kind of write on it anymore. It's but I just correspond through email.
Maybe I'm slow. The act of smuggling it in is the performance. This is not to be preserved. I mean, foolscap is not preserved. I mean, usually one writes drafts on it and it gets balled up and thrown in the garbage can, no?
No, but I mean, even like cocktail napkins get preserved. If somebody important writes on it, then you guys swoop in. They take these things, they spray them, they deacidify them, and they become part of the permanent source text.
Oh, so where you're smuggling it in is somewhere.
Capitol Hill and the coalition governments. So it goes under the noses of politicians, people with all the power.
Yes.
And so, if they or their assistants use this paper as stationery, then that increases the chances that some of
It's
it.
archived?
That's the hope.
They don't use waste baskets. I mean, nothing ever goes in a
No.
waste basket.
Well, I mean, the current administration, I'm sure, but, no, I mean, so that's one of the things, like, what I do.
I mean,
Yeah.
they govern at the moment with the waste basket. That's just
Yeah,
very.
Yeah. So that's one reason, instead of just smuggling, it also became very difficult to repeatedly deliver boxes of blank paper to.
Didn't it raise suspicion that it's printed only on one side?
Well,
Not yet?
I'm sure it raises, all manner of things raises suspicion these days. But that's one of the reasons I opened it up to have people use it as stationery, because for security reasons, the letters that you send, if you wrote a letter to George Walker Bush's library, they would preserve that letter if for any reason, if only for security reasons. This is what I've been told, because all the crazies and the, protesters, all these things that people who they follow do.
You don't need every piece to be preserved. You need enough examples to be preserved in enough places that at some future date, at some future point, someone clever, like one of us, a little clever, is gonna say, hey, hey, you look, I see these, someone's gonna notice it just by looking at it, someone with really good eyes, and they're gonna notice that it's on a piece with one side, and then they're gonna start looking through. I mean, your project will come to fruition maybe in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years.
Maybe, I mean, yeah,
And it doesn't matter, I'm just saying, it doesn't matter if you said, if you put in 100,000 pieces of paper, if 100 of them get noticed, that's a great success.
yeah, that's the hope, yeah.
Like sperms and eggs.
Yeah.
You only need one.
But I also have been sharing it with them in a real upfront way, like to see, like, you know, what would one of the architects of the invasion, what would they say if we presented this object, you know? And so that's been.
What did they say?
Man, Alberto Gonzalez was a real jerk.
So you had just like let out a rule, right?
He was making a series of jokes. So we were at the Chautauqua Institute giving a talk that's in Western New York, an odd booking, double booking, and so he was talking about drones and cybersecurity. I think we were under because I'm also a media artist and I work in print, but also like kind of robotics and all this other stuff. And so he was constantly making jokes about drone strikes. Like he said, oh, the front row is empty, like, you know, maybe some drones took them out. Like he was really being pretty insensitive. And so when I shared the project with him, I have a video of this online as well. And so he was like, oh, what are all the lines going to disappear or something, you know? And then like I explained to him what it is, and then he says thank you, and then his men sort of like politely took me away.
I have a nice story to tell all of us. My first micrography was done when I was 10 years old. You wonder why? I was in Israel, we had a new teacher, and we all were 11 years old, and we had lots of fun. And the teacher punished all the class to write by tomorrow morning 20 times the Song of Moses, Shirat Moshe. So we had to go home and copy 20 pages. I used to make cartoon, and paper was expensive in Israel in 56 or 1960. Paper was expensive.
I didn't want to waste 20 pages, so everybody wrote 20 pages, and I wrote 1 page. So the teacher said, where are the rest of the paper? And I said, look very carefully. I wrote, microscopically, the Song of Moses. So I know the Song of Moses by heart, since I copied it 20 times. So when we run into other Israelis, they say, you know also the song, were you punished too?
In America, I heard that you guys say, I will not make noise in the class, right? Copy whatever, or I will not. The teacher was smart. Say if they copy a song, they will remember it. It was much more educational way of punishing us. But talking about micrography, I'm an artist who have made 3% of my body of work in Hebrew microscopic writing. In Judaism, there is a prayer say that when you put the tefillin, the Hasidic Jew or the Orthodox observant Jews pray, it say the prayer should be inscribed between your eyes. The idea, how could you do that? So they went to someone and said, could you make a box and inside the prayer? They went to the specialist who made it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until it was a small box. And inside there is a whole prayer. They didn't want to look ridiculous with a huge box. So there was a pragmatic reason. There were pragmatic reason to write very small. The mezuzah, when you walk to in the diaspora, why should you advertise that you're Jewish in the danger? So they went to the one who was able to make the smallest and smallest mezuzah. There's no reason why mezuzah should be that big. It should not be huge. To advertise the fact that you're Jewish, we have a huge menorah in New York, why can't do this? They went to the one who was writing very small. To talk about the fact that you may have to escape, and it's easier to escape with a small than big. A Torah is huge. This month, 45 years ago, I was in a war in Yom Kippur in Israel. I was not in Sinai, I was in Egypt. If we were the other side of the Suez Canal, we say, are you in Egypt? We were celebrating Hanukkah. near the city of Suez, and we was wondering, are we going to spend Passover? Because if we spend Passover and then we have to leave Egypt, we'll be leaving Egypt again. But Kissinger signed an accord, and suddenly, in the morning, the religious Orthodox soldiers were praying. And the secular one, we say, well, who knows if we leave, let's join and go and pray. So we had and to my stunning surprise, they had a small mini Torah, literally small, that size. It was kosher. Now in the daytime, in the desert, you could read microscopic. It was not micrography, it was a small micro Torah. So they had micro Torah, micro Megillah, micro to be able to escape. So the very pragmatic reason, the way I did my micrography when I was 10 years old, it was a microscope. There was a very, I believe that Indian miniatures were done without a studio, under a tree with a small scale, with vegetable dye as colors, and so there were pragmatic reasons to that concept as well. Yeah.
Well, I think also, I mean, you say that the prayer should be inscribed on your head. I mean, there are many, many prayers that are in German micrography. They're all the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed. They're things that you memorize. So you don't even need, you don't need the text. The text is there to reinforce what you already know. It's already inscribed, what you've already memorized, what you've already gone through and repeated and repeated and repeated. It's just there as a visual marker.
By the same token, so the tefillot that are in, the prayers that are inside the tefillin are things that you learn, you learn in grade school. You know the Shema, Vahen, Shema, Vayaki, V'yachad. I mean, you learn, if you're in the right school, you've gotten all those by the time you're in second grade. And you know them by heart. But I think your point is well taken, that there are instances where things are made smaller for the portability, and that can extend to if you have to leave someplace in a hurry. But I will tell you that you're showing too big a size. The smallest Torah, the smallest kosher Torah that exists in a private collection in the Midwest is 1 inch, 1 1/8 inches.
And kosher Torah.
Mm-hmm.
Ah. That's interesting.
So now that's, by the way, that was not done for anyone to escape. That was done as a conceit. It was done to show how small, how small can you go.
No, but in our case, we didn't want to carry a big Torah with a sign.
I understand. I'm just saying, the reason for miniaturizing things, the reasons for making things small run the gamut from a devotional device that you can just, you see one word and you know what the rest of the prayers are, or to sometimes the smallest is like the biggest, someone wants to have the biggest car, the biggest plane, the biggest this. It's a lot easier to have the smallest thing until you get so small and then it becomes as expensive as the biggest.
I want to, open it up for questions, because we're getting close to 8 o'clock. So questions for any of our panelists.
These people are making images out of words. I'm wondering if there's some motivation to do that because you're not supposed to make graven images.
Okay. See if I can do this like I rehearsed. The second commandment, which says thou shalt not have any graven image, that's the part that gets quoted. The fact is, if you look in the biblical text, there is a whole rest of the verse which says you shall not pray to them, you shall not worship them. The point is that this notion that images are not to be used, in certainly the Jewish tradition, is a mischaracterization. That being said, there are times in Jewish history, times and locations which were iconoclastic, where the use having more to do with the milieu in which people are operating. So typically in Islamic countries, you're going to see a lot more calligraphic work rather than figural representation. But it is a long-standing misconception that Jews don't use figural representation. We use it all the time and throughout history, pretty much. It happens to be, though, that, and in Van Gelder's case, in the case of these lithographs, they're, except for that one element which is added into the Masonic, rondel at the top, there's no micrographic artistry. There's not, the letters are not forming any shapes. I mean, some are in hearts, some are, but there you have these 80-something images, and they're surrounded by, like copious amounts of text. And so, I think that the term in French is horror vacui, the horror of leaving any empty space. And there's a Mexican Jewish artist named Pedro. I'm sorry, I have it on my computer. Who also, in fact, his catalog raisonné discusses how his work is reminiscent of Van Gelder. Because you look at it and it just like, there's a lot going on there. You don't see any spare ground. You don't see any empty space.
Unless we have any other questions from anyone else? I have one question for you, because your work is very much about memorials, and we cited Maya Lin and Chris Burden, and are there other instances of projects like this or other kinds of memorials that have influenced you or other artists that have influenced you?
Oh gosh,
Whether
yeah,
it's
but
paintings.
I think Chris Burden's, I think the title is The Other,
Right.
The Other Vietnam Memorial. It's this piece with large copper pages.
Cover plates with names of Vietnamese who died, right?
Yeah, but I like that piece. I mean, Chris Burden's brilliant, but at the time, he didn't have access to, and we didn't have a record of the Vietnamese civilians, of the complete account of their deaths. And so what he did is he worked with a computer programmer, and they used some Vietnamese phone books, and then wrote a program that procedurally generated unique names so that they were stand-ins, like for the individuals. And so, although I really appreciate that work, I wanted my project to be grounded in I didn't. That was an interesting technique for the time that he was making, but we're in a sort of era of big data and this sort of the ability to actually gather these names exist. And as like Donald Rumsfeld said in this like Fox News interview, like he said, when asked by what's his name, Snow, who went on to be the press secretary for the Bush administration, they said, well, we hear about our casualties, but we never hear about theirs. Why? And then Rumsfeld said, well, we don't do body counts on other people, which was exposed to be a lie because when the Iraq war logs came out through WikiLeaks, it was exposed that actually we did have details of that. But yeah, Harold Fletcher also has a piece called the American War, which is a photographic piece that looks at the American War in Vietnam from the perspective from the Vietnamese perspective. And that piece was really powerful to me because, like I said, my family, both of my father and stepfather were veterans, and it was interesting, like how I grew up, hearing it's like the Vietnam War. That just, as a term, made sense to me. And then you reach a certain age when you realize that, they're the American War. All the wars we participate in are also the American wars. And so I think there's something about how we name things. This kind of, this kind of just selfishness as well.
Great, well, thank you all for coming. Yes,
We have another couple, I wanted to ask Freyda a question.
Sure.
I mentioned to you earlier about the Jewish court lithograpers and calligraphers, notably Aaron Wolf's Perlman, and the competition that took place. And the competition pieces that they produced, both Kevin and Rishon Zimmel, had examples of many different languages. They were to show off, what they could do. And I noticed that, these are in German or Latin?
Sure.
German. And the large image from the self-portrait of Püchler, that's in English.
Yeah.
In the text. Do you have any example of Christian micographers using either other alphabets, Greek perhaps, or Hebrew?
Well, Püchler traveled around, and whatever country he was in, he would create the micrography in the native language of the land that he was in. So he was able either to incorporate it himself or to use others to create the text and then to copy it. But they're all Latin.
They're all Latin.
They're all Latin characters, yeah.
Great. Well, everyone's welcome to stay a few more minutes and see the rest of the show. We have a room in the back and ask questions. So thank you all for coming.